Mark Sullivan, a 54-year-old veteran police officer, had just relocated to the small, tight-knit town of Millstone, South Carolina. Known for its picturesque streets and old-world charm, the town also carried a reputation for an unspoken divide. Mark had taken up the position of chief of police, ready to bring his years of experience to improve law enforcement in this community. Before his official introduction, Mark decided to explore the town on his own. Donning a weathered jacket and a worn cap, he hoped to blend in and get an unfiltered look at the people and culture. He entered a local diner, but the atmosphere shifted as soon as he walked in. The casual chatter faded, replaced by whispers and sideways glances. Two officers sitting in a corner booth locked eyes with him, their smirks indicating trouble. "Hey, old-timer," one of them called out as Mark grabbed a coffee to go. "You look lost. We don't get many strangers here." Mark kept his response neutral. "Just passing through." As he turned to leave, the taller officer, Cole Jacobs, threw a parting shot. "Maybe keep passing, old man. Folks like you don't last here." Mark walked out, his calm demeanor masking a storm brewing inside. It wasn't his first time dealing with arrogant officers, but he hadn't expected this hostility right off the bat. The next morning, Mark went for an early jog on the outskirts of town. Halfway through, a patrol car pulled up beside him. It was Jacobs and his partner, Mike Turner, a burly man with a cocky grin. "Runner, you lost?" Jacobs shouted, the sarcasm in his voice unmistakable. Mark stopped, catching his breath. "Just enjoying the fresh air," he replied evenly. "Well, strangers don't get the warmest welcome around here," Turner added with a sneer. Before Mark could respond, they got out of the car and started patting him down without explanation. When Jacobs found a piece of trash in Mark's pocket, he held it up triumphantly. Well, Jacobs said, smirking. "Looks like we've got ourselves a troublemaker." Mark clenched his jaw but stayed silent. The officers grabbed him, dragging him back into town. To his disbelief, they tied him to a lamp post in the middle of the square, making a spectacle of it. Bystanders watched, some recording the incident, others laughing or shaking their heads. Mark stood quietly, letting the officers dig their own graves. By the following morning, the video of the incident had gone viral. Local news outlets picked up the story, and speculation ran wild. The sight of two officers tying a man to a lamppost in the middle of town was shocking enough, but the twist came when people started wondering who this stranger was. Meanwhile, Mark prepared for his first official day on the job as chief of police, knowing full well the commotion waiting for him at the station. Walking into the precinct, Mark wore his full uniform, the badge gleaming on his chest. The office was buzzing with chatter, but it died abruptly as he entered. All eyes were on him. Cole Jacobs and Mike Turner, leaning casually by their desks, looked up, and the color drained from their faces when they saw him. Their expressions shifted from confusion to dawning horror as the realization sank in. They had made a huge mistake. Mark let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed on the two men. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but commanding. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Mark began, his tone calm but his eyes piercing. "It seems some of our officers believe they're above the law." He paused, watching as Turner shifted uncomfortably, and Jacobs' bravado visibly wilted. "Did neither of you think to check who I was before pulling your little stunt?" Turner's face had gone pale, and he swallowed hard, looking as though he wanted to be anywhere but there. Jacobs, though, attempted to recover his bravado, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Chief, it was just a harmless tradition," Jacobs said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Keeps outsiders in line, you know?" Mark raised an eyebrow, his tone icy as he responded. "Tradition? Publicly humiliating people isn't tradition, it's abuse of power. And it ends today." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before holding it up. The video of their actions the previous day began playing, the sound of Jacobs and Turner's mocking laughter echoing through the now silent room. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of the situation beginning to settle over them like a heavy fog. Mark's voice grew firmer as he addressed the two men directly. "Effective immediately, both of you are suspended." Hand over your badges. Jacobs opened his mouth to argue, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for support. But Mark cut him off before he could utter a word. Save it, Mark said, his voice cold and unwavering. The town deserves better, and so does this department. We're here to protect and serve, not intimidate and humiliate. Jacob's face flushed red with a mix of anger and embarrassment as he reluctantly pulled his badge from his belt. Turner followed suit, his hand trembling slightly as he placed his badge on the desk. The room erupted into murmurs, officers exchanging incredulous looks. No one had expected such swift action, especially not on the chief's first day. Mark took a deep breath and turned to address the rest of the team. He knew that what he said next would set the tone for his leadership in Millstone. From now on, he began, his voice carrying through the room, this department will operate with integrity and respect. Any behavior that disrespects our community will not be tolerated. We're here to serve, not intimidate. I expect every one of you to remember that. He let his gaze pass over each officer, making sure his words sank in. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable with the change in expectations. Mark understood that change wouldn't come easily, but he was determined to see it through. After dismissing the officers, Mark walked to his office, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. He knew that Jacobs and Turner were not the only ones with problematic behavior. The culture in Millstone's police department had been allowed to fester for far too long, and it would take time to root out the rot. But he was ready for the fight. Mark sat at his desk, looking out the window at the town square. He could see the lamppost where he had been tied up just the day before. It stood there as a reminder of the work that needed to be done, the changes that needed to be made, not just in the department, but in the community as a whole. As the day wore on, Mark received a call from the mayor. She wanted to know what had happened and why half of the town had seen their new police chief tied to a lamppost in a viral video. Mark explained everything, his voice calm and direct. The mayor listened, and after a long pause, she spoke. Chief Sullivan, I appreciate your honesty. This town needs change, and it seems like you're the right person for the job. You have my full support. Mark thanked her and hung up, a sense of resolve settling over him. He knew he wouldn't be able to change everything overnight, but he had taken the first step. He had made it clear that abuse of power would not be tolerated, and that was a start. Later that evening, Mark attended a community meeting. The air was thick with tension as residents gathered, many of them having seen the video or heard rumors of what had happened. Mark stood at the front of the room, looking out at the skeptical faces before him. Good evening, he began, his voice steady. My name is Mark Sullivan, and I'm your new chief of police. I know some of you may have questions about what happened yesterday, and I want you to know that I am here to answer them. I am committed to making this town a safer, more respectful place for everyone. A hand shot up from the back of the room. An elderly woman, her face lined with years of worry, spoke up. Chief, are you really going to change things? Or is this just talk? Mark met her gaze, his expression sincere. Ma'am, I didn't come here to make empty promises. I came here to make a difference. And I won't stop until this town is the place it deserves to be. A murmur of approval rippled through the room, and for the first time, Mark saw a glimmer of hope in their eyes. It was just a beginning, but it was enough to make him believe that change was possible. And he wasn't going to stop until that belief became reality. The fallout was swift. The prosecutor's office launched an investigation into Jacobs and Turner, uncovering a pattern of misconduct that spanned years. They had left behind a trail of intimidation, harassment, and abuse of power, and the community was finally ready to speak up. Emboldened by Mark's leadership, residents who had stayed silent for too long began coming forward. They shared stories of mistreatment, of run-ins with Jacobs and Turner that left them feeling vulnerable and powerless. The courtroom became the stage for long overdue justice, and the town of Millstone watched as these officers were held accountable for their actions. Mark worked tirelessly to rebuild the bridge between the police department and the community. He knew that trust could not be restored overnight. It had to be earned through action, consistency, and genuine engagement. One of his first initiatives was to hold open forums at the community center, inviting residents to voice their concerns and share their stories. These meetings were difficult at times, Emotions ran high, and the wounds caused by years of neglect and abuse were raw, but Mark welcomed the honesty. He listened without defensiveness, taking notes, making changes, and ensuring that the voices of the community were not just heard but valued. Mark also implemented new training programs for the entire department. He focused on community policing, emphasizing empathy, respect, and understanding, and brought in experts to speak on issues of racial bias and de-escalation tactics. He understood that for true change to occur, his officers needed to be retrained, not just in procedure but in mindset. It wasn't an easy process. There were a few officers who resisted the new changes, who balked at the idea of being held to a higher standard. But Mark was unwavering. He made it clear that the days of unchecked power and intimidation were over, and those unwilling to change had no place in his department. The shift in the department didn't go unnoticed by the town. Slowly, the people of Millstone began to feel a sense of hope. One day, during a community meeting, an elderly woman approached Mark. Her hands were trembling, her eyes filled with tears. "Chief Sullivan," she said, her voice quivering, "thank you. For the first time in years, I feel safe in my own town." Her words moved Mark deeply, solidifying his resolve. This was why he had taken the job, to make a real difference. He thought of his own experiences, the years he had spent witnessing injustice, the times when the system had failed the very people it was meant to protect. He had vowed then that if he ever found himself in a position to create change, he would. And now, here in Millstone, he had that chance. In the weeks that followed, the prosecutor's case against Jacobs and Turner gained momentum. The community's support was overwhelming. People who had once feared retaliation now stood up, providing testimony, sharing their experiences, and demanding justice. The courtroom was packed every day of the trial, and the local media covered every moment. The town was no longer willing to stay silent, and their collective voice was powerful. The verdict came in swift and definitive. Guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and harassment. Jacobs and Turner were sentenced, and the sense of relief that swept through the town was palpable. For the first time in a long time, the people of Millstone felt that justice had been served, that their voices had been heard, and that their community was finally on the path to healing. Mark didn't stop there. He knew that holding two officers accountable was only the beginning. There was still much work to be done to change the culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive. He partnered with local organizations, creating outreach programs to connect officers with the community in meaningful ways. He encouraged his officers to participate in town events, to get to know the residents they served as people rather than as names on a report. One initiative that became particularly successful was the Youth Mentorship Program. Mark paired officers with local teenagers, many of whom had grown up viewing the police with suspicion or fear. The program aimed to break down barriers, to foster understanding and trust. Slowly but surely, those relationships began to blossom. Officers who had once patrolled the streets with a sense of detachment found themselves invested in the lives of the young people they mentored. And the teenagers, in turn, began to see the police not as a force to be feared but as allies in their community. One crisp autumn afternoon, Mark received a letter from a young man named Tyler, one of the participants in the mentorship program. Tyler had been skeptical of the police, having had several negative experiences with Jacobs in the past. But in his letter, he wrote about how his perspective had changed. "Chief Sullivan," the letter read, "I used to think all cops were like Jacobs, mean, abusive, and full of hate. But Officer Ramirez has shown me that there are good people in uniform too. He listens to me, helps me with my schoolwork, and actually cares about what happens to me. I just wanted to say thank you for making this happen. It's made a big difference in my life." Mark read the letter twice, feeling a warmth spread through him. It was letters like this, moments like this, that made the struggle worthwhile. He knew the journey wasn't over, that there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time since he had come to Millstone, he felt that they were truly on the right path. As the sun began to set over the town, Mark stood in the square, looking at the lamppost where he had once been tied. It had become a symbol, not of humiliation, but of resilience. The town of Millstone was healing, one step at a time, and Mark was determined to see it through. Together, they would build a community based on respect, trust, and accountability, A community where everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from, could feel safe. Months later, Millstone had begun to transform. The police department's renewed focus on integrity had brought about a noticeable shift in the town's atmosphere. Officers were no longer just uniformed figures enforcing the law. They had become familiar faces who listened, cared, and responded to the needs of the people. The air felt different, lighter, more hopeful. Residents who had once avoided law enforcement altogether now greeted officers on the street, and the barriers that had divided the town began to dissolve. Jacobs and Turner, now stripped of their badges, faced the full consequences of their actions in court. Their smug arrogance had vanished, replaced by a palpable fear as they were confronted with the harm they had caused. The courtroom was packed each day of their trial. Community members watched as justice unfolded. For many, seeing the two disgraced officers held accountable marked the end of an era of intimidation and abuse. It was the beginning of a new chapter for Millstone. Mark Sullivan, reflecting on the journey, felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. The road hadn't been easy. It had been filled with confrontations, uncomfortable truths, and challenges that tested his resolve. But it was worth every effort. The town, which once felt like it had been drowning in fear and division, was now on a path toward healing and growth. The steps were small, but each one brought them closer to the community that Millstone deserved to be. One bright morning, as Mark walked through the town square, a group of children playing nearby spotted him. They waved excitedly, their smiles wide and genuine. Mark tipped his hat, his heart swelling with a warmth that words couldn't quite capture. The children's innocent happiness felt like a symbol of hope, proof that the next generation could grow up in a better Millstone, one where justice and unity prevailed. As Mark continued walking, he passed by the community center where a group of officers were holding a workshop for local residents. The workshop, focused on safety and awareness, was something Mark had initiated to further connect the department with the people it served. He paused at the door, watching as Officer Ramirez stood before a small crowd, explaining ways to stay safe while encouraging open dialogue about their concerns. Mark couldn't help but smile. Ramirez, once quiet and hesitant, had grown into a leader, someone the community trusted and turned to for support. Later that day, Mark visited the Youth Mentorship Program, another initiative that had blossomed in the months since Jacobs and Turner's suspension. The program had become a cornerstone of Millstone's transformation, pairing officers with local teenagers who needed guidance and a positive influence. The once skeptical youths were now actively engaging with their mentors, breaking down the distrust that had existed for so long. Mark walked into the gymnasium where the mentorship activities were taking place. He watched as Officer Carter played basketball with a group of teens, laughter echoing off the walls. It was hard to believe that just months ago, this same space had been filled with tension and unease. Now, it was a place of connection, of hope. One of the teenagers, a young girl named Mia, noticed Mark and ran over to him, her face beaming. "Chief Sullivan," she called out, "want to join us for a game?" Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "I think I'll leave the basketball to you pros," he replied, ruffling her hair affectionately. "But I'll be cheering you on." Mia grinned and ran back to her friends, her laughter mixing with the others. Mark watched them play, a deep sense of fulfillment settling over him. This, the joy, the sense of community, was exactly what he had hoped for when he first took the job. He wanted Millstone to be a place where everyone, especially the young, could thrive without fear. In the months since the incident, Mark had seen countless moments like this, moments that showed just how far they had come. The police department, once viewed as an enemy by many, had become a part of the community it served. It wasn't perfect, and Mark knew there would always be work to do, but the change was undeniable. He could see it in the smiles of the children, in the grateful nods from business owners, and in the way people no longer crossed the street to avoid officers. That evening, Mark stood on the porch of his small house, looking out at the quiet town. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over Millstone. He thought back to his first few days here, how uncertain he had felt, how deeply rooted the problems seemed. He remembered being tied to that lamppost, the mocking laughter of Jacobs and Turner, the faces of bystanders who didn't dare intervene. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, That same lamppost was just a part of the town square, a symbol not of humiliation but of resilience, of the strength that had emerged from those dark moments. Mark knew that there were still challenges ahead, new obstacles to overcome, new problems to solve. But he wasn't alone. He had a team of officers who believed in the same vision, who were willing to work alongside him to make that vision a reality. And more importantly, he had a community that had found its voice, a community that understood the power of standing together. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, Mark took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace. Millstone had a long way to go, but they were on the right path. They were healing, growing, and becoming stronger with each passing day. And Mark Sullivan was honored to be a part of that journey. Together, they were writing a new chapter, one built on respect, accountability, and, above all, hope.